Well, hello, church family, and all those who are watching this. My name is Will Cochran. I'm the minister of Cookfield Baptist Church. We've just started a series in the book of Esther. We were looking at Esther chapter 1 on Sunday morning and thinking about some of the context to the book of Esther. Most people are watching at home, and therefore some of the pictures on the screen were blurry because they were projected. And a number emailed or got in touch and said, "Oh, we'd love to just you to put together a little video about some of the history with the pictures there." And I don't need much invitation for those of you who know me to talk about politics, history and theology all in one thing. So this is something of the background, the historical background of the book of Esther, which will set us up nicely for chapter 2 for this Sunday. This is really like the kind of bonus features on a DVD. It's not, you don't need to know this, but it's nice to know if you're into this kind of thing. We were thinking about who rules the world, and at least it felt like in the 480 BC time that it was King Xerxes. Here he is with his scepter. We'll come back to that later in Esther. He was the one who ruled the world at the time. At least it felt like that. This was his empire. This was the map you would have seen on Sunday if you were watching. But up close, so you see the Middle East with Jerusalem down here somewhere, Egypt, modern day Turkey. This is where this Asia Minor area is. Nineveh, the old capital of Assyria. Babylon, the old capital of Babylonia, and Susa. And it was from Susa that Xerxes ruled his empire. It was the citadel of Susa that we were thinking about. It's kind of in modern day Iran, so it's the western bottom, southwestern Iran today, and it's still there. So this is the picture you would have seen on Sunday from the Google Maps. It's been dug up by the French, and this is it today with some labels. Let me just take you through these because you won't be able to see as clearly on Sunday if you're watching from home. This is the garden courtyard, where all the pillars are, which we'll think about in a minute. This is where the big feast and the big banquet and the big party was held that we saw in Esther chapter 1, the 180 days of celebration with all the nobles and officials. You can see here, number 2, the kind of courtyard of the harem, where we'll see that Mordecai kind of wanders around. You'll see number 3, the second courtyard, and in a courtyard, number 4, but that would have led to the throne room, which is number 5. So Xerxes' throne would have been around here somewhere, and probably on a slope looking down, so that to enter the number 4, this area here, you would have needed Xerxes to lift his scepter. We'll come back to that, but that seems to be all one room or area. And number 6 here is the royal apartments, basically Xerxes' bedroom. This is the same place that was built by King Darius, down in the lion's den, that kind of thing. It all happens around here. It would have been an amazing place to be, as we were thinking a bit about on Sunday, that reading from Esther 1. It would have been the definition of opulence at the time, and even, frankly, even by today's standards. It was a very impressive place to be, and we saw something of that, didn't we, about the alluring nature and the impressive nature of empire, and how it's all about what you can see. This is one of the pillars you see kind of over here. This is an artist's impression, but one of the pillars here, the French have got one of them in the Louvre in Paris. This is this thing at the top of a pillar. It would already have been 21 meters high. Impressive. That's the point. More generally, in terms of big Bible history, it's worth just reflecting on where we're up to in the Bible story by the way of context. So remember, God has brought his people out of Egypt, brought them to the land. Under Joshua, they go into the land. Eventually, King David becomes king, sets himself up in Jerusalem. And things are going well. It's about 1000 BC at that point. His son then becomes king, King Solomon. Things are going amazingly well. You have the Queen of Sheba coming and checking him out and all that kind of thing. But then things really start to go south. And you have all the wives. he dies. The kingdom splits in two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom goes really bad really quickly. And eventually the nation of Assyria, which is growing at this point in the capital, Nineveh, then comes down and basically takes over and smashes the northern kingdom. And we never really hear from those 10 northern tribes again. Southern kingdom, still pretty bad. Some good kings, notably Josiah, but eventually things go really bad. The northern kingdom was destroyed, I think, at 722 BC. And eventually Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians, who have since taken over the Assyrian Empire themselves. The Babylonians come down and conquer Jerusalem in 587 BC. And God's people are carried off to Babylon. And you can read about that in Daniel. But then sometime later, around 538 BC, a guy called Cyrus becomes king, and it becomes a king a bit before that, of the Persian Empire, which is kind of down here, and eventually it takes over. And this is a guy called Cyrus. He's the first kind of Persian king, Medo-Persian king. And he takes, we'll come back to that in a minute, and he takes over this huge empire, and you can see how he just swallows the nation of Babylon and the former area of Assyria, including the area of the biblical times, with the Middle East, Palestine, Israel, that kind of area, all the way over to Greece, which we'll come back to in just a moment. Cyrus the Great. And in 539, he captures Babylon and formally defeats them. And then in 738, that's it, he allows God's people to return from Babylon to the land, to the promised land. And you can read about the exiles coming home in Nehemiah and so on and so forth. They don't have to return home. Many do, but many don't, and many can go or are forced to stay around. And so actually what you have is a lot of Jews spread around the empire as it was known. So some returned, even many returned, but many didn't, and they're scattered around. The policy that Cyrus had, genius as it was that basically to try and keep peace in what was a massive empire, he allowed people to return to their homes and kind of rule themselves as long as they did ultimately what he said on the kind of bigger issues. And we know, for example, about one of these from the Cyrus Cylinder, famously, that talks about the defeat of Babylon and the freeing of people to be able to go back to their native lands. And that the Cyrus Cylinder records what happened in 539, 538 BC, including Israel. But as part of that, Cyrus, this is modern day Turkey up here, part of that, Cyrus had taken over all this area up here. So a huge great land up into modern day Turkey. So Istanbul is kind of around here somewhere. But there were these city-states down here that didn't really like being ruled, and they rebelled in under King Darius, who came a little bit after, in 499. They revolted. So King Darius again follows King Cyrus eventually, so King Darius is now king from the capital of Susa. And in 499, these city-states rebel. They don't like being ruled, and they like having connections with the Greek civilization over here, which is growing. That eventually is repelled in 493 BC, but King Darius doesn't take kindly to the fact that the Greeks have helped an insurrection, and so decides to try and smash Greece. And so in 492, he moves into this area of Macedonia to try and smash the Greeks. But that is defeated famously at the Battle of Marathon in 490. That famous story where the battle is won, and this guy runs all the way from Marathon to, I think it's to Athens or to wherever they're taking the message to, and delivers the message, "We've won," to the Greek rulers, and falls down and died. And that's where the distance of 26 and a bit miles is. That's why it's called Marathon. Darius is defeated. and is defeated at 490 BC. What that does, though, is it unites the Spartans under Leonidas and the Greeks, the Athenians under Themistocles, and we'll come back to that in just a moment. Now, coming back to why all this? Well, because 7-10 years later, Xerxes, who we've been thinking about in Esther, he decides, I want to take revenge for my dad. I want to reclaim our honour. I want to smash the Greeks. I want to do what my dad failed to do and smash these pesky Greeks. And that wasn't just a revenge thing. It was a different civilization. It was a different way of doing things because, of course, you have the Greeks with their philosophy and their democracy, such as it was. Most people couldn't vote, but it was a bit different to a dictatorship. So there was a kind of cultural clash too. So Xerxes wanted to smash the Greeks in a show of strength. That's and that's what the people were preparing for in Esther chapter 1, where they had this great feast where they get all the officials together as they prepare to go off for war in 480 BC. So 480, they come up here, they cross the Hellespont. They cross the Hellespont here, famously where Homer said 800 or so years earlier that the Troy, the city of Troy, infamous city of Troy, with the Trojan horse and all that kind of thing, that happened in the Hellespont. They cross the Hellespont, come down here, and seek to take on the Greeks. So they cross the Hellespont in April. Things don't go brilliantly. So famously, they have a battle in Thermopylae where Leonidas and his Spartan warriors essentially try and hold the Persians off as long as they can in this area called Thermopylae. Now, it looks a bit different today. See the mountains on the left and the road on the right. That road, or maybe even a bit closer here, is where the sea used to be. And famously, these 300 or so, probably a little bit more, Spartan warriors held off this huge Persian king for about 3 days they fought. And famously, here we go, is a picture that might be a bit more what it looked like. They held them off and allowed a retreat that helped them to save lots and lots of troops. And that was famously immortalised in the film 300, which some of you may have seen. It's quite gory, but it depicts this, what called the Hot Gates, the Battle of Thermopylae. But eventually they get down here, and there is a huge battle on the cards. Xerxes has some 200,000 troops. He has something like 1,000 ships, and it's all looking pretty ominous. And eventually it all comes to a head. Themistocles has to retreat with his navy. The Athenians going to bring the navy, and Leonidas brings the troops, basically. And they have what is basically the big battle that decides all this at Salamis in the autumn of 480. Here, you may have been to the island. I'm sure it's a lovely island. I've never been there. But in 480, there is the huge battle between Xerxes, the Persians, and the Greeks. And this is it today, in the middle of water. Xerxes would have been on the hill here somewhere looking over, and the Athenians would have been on this side. So not a very big stretch of water. And this was the battle of Salamis. And here is a little video just outlining what happened.
Themistocles knew that there was no retreat and formed up his navy. The Athenians were on the left, Peloponnesian ships were on the right, and Spartans, Corinthians, and other contingents were in the centre. The Persian fleet consisted of ships built and manned by the Egyptians, Phoenicians, and the Greeks of Asia Minor. Xerxes did not need to fight this battle, as he was well supplied. His advisors were suggesting to stay in the open waters and wait for the Greeks to try and break out. The Greeks were outnumbered at least 2 to 1, and any attempt to fight on the high seas would be catastrophic. Xerxes sent a small group to take the island of Psytalia, while Egyptian portions of the navy, which had suffered most of the damage at Artemisium, were left behind to cover other exits around the island of Salamis. In the morning, the Persian fleet entered the Straits of Salamis with Phoenicians on the right, Ionians on the left, and other Greeks in the centre. Early in the morning, the Corinthian ships moved back. Persian commanders thought that the Greeks were in a panic and ordered the navy forward. The Greeks moved their ships further backwards, imitating a retreat, and the Persians reformed into a diamond formation to attack the enemy center. Still, the straits were very narrow, and now there was not enough space for the Persian vessels to maneuver. The Greek retreat was indeed just a trap. Themistocles knew the weather conditions and gave the order to counterattack right when the wind changed. The wind was now blowing from the east, and that sped up Greek ships while slowing down their opponents. This allowed the Greek ships to attack in a narrow front, and as their vessels were heavier, the Persians were stopped in their tracks, becoming bunched together. The diamond formation also did not help, as it allowed the Corinthians to shift to the left flank and attack the Persian right. As some Persian commanders were killed early in the battle, most of their navy was left without higher command. The Greeks also were dominating in the boarding actions, as their heavy hoplites were easily defeating the light Persian infantrymen. Other Persian lines did not have enough room to help, and had to slowly retreat from the straits under increasing pressure from the Greek flanks. Xerxes watched the battle from his throne set on a nearby mountain, but couldn't do anything to change the course of this engagement. The Persians lost around 300 ships, and although they still had a few hundred more, the invasion was in disarray. Xerxes retreated to Asia to avoid being trapped in Europe. He left a land army to fight on, but it was defeated in 479 BC during the Battle of Plataea. At the same time, the Persian navy was defeated yet again at Mycala in Ionia.
And so Xerxes returns home, tail between his legs, in 479 BC, after a few more battles as we saw, heads back home to Susa with his tail between his legs, defeated and humiliated. Not so powerful, not so invincible now. And we pick up the story in Esther chapter 2 sometime later. Probably about 4 or so years later, 3 or 4 years later, we pick up the story in Esther chapter 2 when he's back.